That's what's happening right now. Okay, so I'm really happy to be introducing the master of ice and glaciers, the guy for your databases from Grafana, Nathan Mars.
All right, Nathan. Let's wait that everything is working. No pressure. All right. Stage is yours.
Can you all hear me? All right. For reference, that glacier reference is just because I told him I like glaciers, so now I'm the master of ice, I guess. So hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about open source and monetization and whether or not it's possible to monetize an open source project without losing what makes it open source in the first place. First off, I need to acknowledge that this talk is titled How You Can Do This, but let's place a qualifier here as the world of open source is very diverse. Here, let's fix the title. Okay, so how to potentially monetize your open source project while keeping its soul intact. That feels a little better. First off, before we jump into the talk, I'd like to get to know you all a little better. How many people here have an open source project that they'd like to monetize? Okay, I'm seeing a few hands. That's good. You're in the right place. How many people here rely on open source projects and have a vested interest in keeping them alive? Should be like everyone here, hopefully. Okay. And how many people here are just curious about the open source world and potential monetization routes? Hopefully, most people here. Yeah. Cool. So now that we have a better understanding of where we're at, we can dive into the material. So my name is Nathan Mars. I'm the tech lead of data visualization at Grafana Labs, and I'm based out of Monterey, California. In my role, I get to contribute to open source every day, working on both maintaining and extending Grafana's data visualization capabilities. Just a heads up, this is actually my first in-person conference talk, so please excuse any nervousness or jitters. I want to deliver as much value to you all as possible, and I'll do my best to do so. So I first fell in love with open source as I was learning how to code. It was amazing how much leverage you could get in a starter project by just importing a few NPM packages. In the world of open source, we really are standing on the shoulders of giants. In fact, Grafana was actually one of those open source projects that caught my eye while working in my first role in an online textbook startup. We were able to leverage and run Grafana open source to monitor our services. Using Grafana, I was able to visualize and document one of my first real wins as a software engineer, optimizing a resource-intensive analytics feature and reducing our cloud compute costs drastically. I still remember obsessing over the dashboard I created with the time series graph showcasing the dramatic reduction in CPU and RAM usage in our servers after my code hit production. I'll also say that I have a deep appreciation for open source, rooted in the foundations of my career. During my day job, I get to write code that is public and open source, and I love every second of it. So for this open source ecosystem to survive, though, these projects need to be maintained, which is not free. Open source does not, at first glance, appear to go hand in hand with monetization, but this is based on a common misconception. Because open source software is commonly referred to as free software, many wrongly assume that this means it is free of cost. In fact, within the context of open source, free refers to the freedom of open source, as users are free to inspect, derive work, redistribute, and run any open source. For an open source project to survive long term, the project maintainers need some way of being rewarded. If this is not the case, the project can die. In last year's Open Source Day, Lee Rantal's talk on the unexpected demise of open source libraries has a great shout out to what happens when we take open source for granted. Spoiler alert, they can die and they do die. So open source monetization has entered the chat. So you might be thinking, let's just charge our open source users. Hold on now, we can't start charging for something that was free before and still be truly open source. Let's start off by taking a look at 3 challenges and 3 misconceptions around monetizing open source. So let's start with the elephant in the room here. Monetizing open source software faces the awkward challenge of convincing users to pay for a product that's been freely available. Open source projects thrive on accessibility, and transitioning to a premium model risks alienating the user base built on generosity. Users may question why they should pay for something that they've obtained for free, creating a delicate balance between demonstrating added value, differentiation, and framing the conversation around sustainability and investment. This requires finesse to avoid undermining the community ethos that propelled the project's success, highlighting the necessity of transparency, communication, and a genuine commitment to user welfare in navigating this delicate balance. Next, the challenge of over-commercialization in open source software. The way to avoid this challenge lies in preserving the community-driven essence that makes these projects thrive. Over-commercialization risks tarnishing the project's reputation as users cherish the collaborative spirit and inclusivity fostered by the community. Striking the right balance is crucial to prevent alienating contributors and users alike, emphasizing the importance of maintaining transparency, fostering open communication, and ensuring that commercial endeavors complement rather than overshadow the project's core values. And lastly, open source projects need to balance both community and commercial interests. This is a pivotal challenge, so we'll take some time to talk through it. Picture this, an open source project thriving on collaborative efforts of passionate volunteers, each driven by the common goal of creating something impactful and accessible. This community-driven ethos is the beating heart of many open source endeavors, fostering innovation and inclusivity. When the time comes to introduce monetization strategies, a proverbial tightrope walk ensues. On one hand, there's the commercial imperative, the need to sustain and grow the project financially. On the other, there's the imperative to honor the spirit of openness, collaboration, and community that defines open source. Imagine a scenario, this is a bit of foreshadowing, recognizing the value of an open source project, a company seeks to monetize an open source project. They might consider avenues like offering premium features, support services, or enterprise versions. Yet, as they delve into monetization strategies, they must tread cautiously. They must avoid any actions that might fracture the community or create a sense of exclusion among the very individuals who contributed their time and expertise selflessly. So why is this balance so critical? Because the essence of open source lies not just in the code itself, but in the vibrant ecosystem it cultivates. It's about fostering a sense of belonging, collaboration, and shared ownership. Alienating the community risks eroding the very foundation upon which the project stands. We'll discuss a few real-world examples of where this balance went wrong near the end of the talk. Now, let's move on to 3 common misconceptions around monetizing open source. The first common misconception is the belief that no changes are necessary to an open source project to generate revenue. In reality, many open source projects are initially developed with a focus on community and collaboration, and successful monetization often entails adjustments to the project's governance, licensing, or development process. Neglecting to adapt to the demands of monetization can hinder the sustainability and growth potential. The second misconception is the belief that relying solely on donations or sponsorships is sufficient for sustainability. While these forms of support can indeed provide valuable resources, they are often inconsistent, unreliable, and may not scale adequately to meet the project's long-term financial needs. Successful monetization strategies typically involve diversifying revenue streams, which may include offerings such as premium services, licensing, or support models to ensure sustainability and stability over time. And here we are. The final misconception is the idea that a company can prioritize its commercial interests over the interests of the open source community without any consequence. In reality, successful monetization strategies are built on the foundation of mutual benefit, where the interests of the community and company align. Prioritizing the community ensures continued engagement, support, and contributions, which in turn foster innovation and sustainability. Neglecting the needs of the community in favor of short-term commercial gains can lead to alienation, loss of trust, and ultimately undermine the very ecosystem that sustains the project's success. Therefore, monetization strategies should carefully be crafted to prioritize the collective welfare of both the open source community and the company behind the project, fostering a symbiotic relationship that drives mutual growth and prosperity. So all this information now that we've covered, we can now kind of dive into Grafana's story of monetization. Before we dive in, does anyone here know what Grafana is already? All right, seeing a good amount of hands, great. So we'll kind of cover this information quickly. In case you don't know, Grafana is a leading open source platform for monitoring and observability. It was first developed in 2013 by Torkel Ortegard and is now maintained by Grafana Labs. Grafana's mission is to make it easy for everyone to understand and monitor their data. So Grafana's core strategy is about having a big tent philosophy, supporting as many data sources as possible and eliminating vendor lock-in. This big tent empowers our users to query, visualize, alert on, and understand their data no matter where it's stored. With Grafana, you can create, explore, and share all of your data through beautiful, flexible dashboards. So Grafana is used by organizations of all sizes to track their performance, identify problems, and make informed decisions. It's a powerful tool that can help organizations improve their efficiency and productivity. So this is interesting here. So in addition to its commercial use, Grafana is also popular with hobbyists and enthusiasts. Many people use Grafana for a wide variety of use cases, from monitoring their home solar power, tracking metrics from their IoT smart devices, or even creating a daily commute assistant dashboard, in this case here. In this example, the dashboard is drawing from APIs and GTFS real-time feeds to pull in data from weather.gov, the Metropolitan Atlanta Transit Authority, and drive time and traffic information from Google Maps and Bing Maps. So if you're ever wondering if Bing has a map service and if someone uses it, you found your answer. Okay, so Grafana's flexibility and ease of use make it a great choice for hobbyists who want to have deeper insight into their data without any real limitations. We've seen Grafana used in the wild from a myriad of use cases, from monitoring popcorn levels in theme parks to helping Japan land on the moon, which is pretty exciting to see. All right, so now that was a quick little shout out about what Grafana actually is. Now that we've kind of delved into that, we can explore Grafana's story at a high level and how Grafana approached monetization. You may have noticed this small dinosaur on the screen. This is Grot, short for Grafana Robot. He's the mascot of Grafana Labs, and he cleans up our GitHub repo. So Grot will help guide us through this story today. So Grafana was born out of Torkel Ortegard's frustration with Graphite's lackluster data visualization tooling. As a result of his frustration, he forked Kibana, an existing open source data visualization software, and built out support for metrics, also known as monitoring, which Kibana at the time did not provide much of any support for. His goal was to make time series data accessible for a wider audience, to make it easier to build dashboards, and to make graphs and dashboards more interactive. He released his creation into the world, and it gained popularity quickly. At this point, Grafana was a one-person show, with Torkel working on improving it as a side project. At this time, his plan was to eventually make a premium version of the software as a route of monetization. These plans would soon change, however, with a chance encounter. The initial year of release was pivotal. Grafana was quickly adopted and spread. For how to build an open source project that achieves wide adoption, you should watch Andrei Sitnik's talk later on today, How to Make Your Open Source Project Popular. It's at the end of today in the schedule. I don't have the answers for you there. Grafana's widespread adoption garnered interest from Raj Dutt and Anthony Woods, who were looking to form a new company in the observability space. They all met together and agreed to form a company around monetizing and commercializing Grafana open source. The three co-founders formed RainTank, now known as Grafana Labs, a company built around Grafana open source, with the initial idea of monetization coming from open SaaS, which is managing and hosting the software for users. As it turns out, this is not so easy in practice to implement, and it was maybe too early in the project's life to be successful. The initial strategy was simple. If you build it, they will come. 100% of the code written in Grafana was open source. The pure focus was on building out the open source project and waiting for monetization to appear as a result of this, which didn't really work. This is an example of the misconception that the management of a project does not need to adapt in the pursuit of monetization. In these early days, the community expressed its interest and support for Grafana and wanting to see it succeed, and even expressed a willingness to pay, but the company needed to figure out its approach to commercialization. One of the first successful avenues was offering premium support. This is one of the most common and simplest monetization models for open source companies. When a company adopts an open source solution, they typically require help integrating it, maintaining it, and debugging it. Relying purely on community support won't be enough, as there's no guarantee that a response will be given promptly, if ever. Although anyone could self-support for a given open source solution, the company behind the solution will often be the preferred choice, as they are more likely to know the internals and be able to ship custom patches swiftly. The disadvantage of relying on support alone is the stress it places on human resources, making it hard to scale. It is, however, essential and thus must be offered eventually. As Grafana's adoption continued to grow and revenue stayed relatively flat, the team at Grafana Labs realized they needed to pivot their approach to monetization. Let's move forward in time. This is around the 2016 to 2018 timeframe, when I actually first discovered Grafana and used it for the first time. Shifting from the paid support model, Grafana Labs set out to try 2 more avenues of monetization. So these are the open core model, enterprise, and hosting open source. So first, Grafana Labs launched Grafana Enterprise in 2016, a paid version with additional premium features and support. This approach is considered the open core model, which was discussed on yesterday. So we're just going to review it again. What is the open core model? Open source projects can be highly complex and elaborate. Some projects maintain a core of open source, which requires active maintenance work and significant amounts of financial expenditure on upfront payment and investment for additional features. As a result, some companies may develop these features outside of the open source project and under their own proprietary software. Open core models grant paid access to these new features and enable the maintenance of open source project without the high cost for the company. So open core, if we're going to kind of reference this something, is kind of similar to the freemium model in the gaming industry, where a game is free to download, but has in-game purchases and to upgrade particular elements or allow access to unique game modes. So Grafana built out some proprietary features into Grafana, primarily in the form of premium data sources that were only usable with an enterprise license or build. So sometimes keeping some features closed source is acceptable, in particular when it doesn't prevent the community from using the core solution. Features like automated backups, integration, hardware acceleration, and other options are all more convenient if available, but they aren't deal breakers. And they can be kept closed source and sold as enterprise features. In Grafana's case, the open source community could still write and create their own data source plugins via Grafana's plugin ecosystem. But those plugins are not officially supported by Grafana Labs, so large companies would prefer to use one that are officially supported by Grafana Labs. So choosing what to open source and what to sell as premium features can be very tricky, and many companies have burnt themselves following the open core business model. It doesn't create a lot of defensibility, as large companies can easily replicate these premium features and sell them as their own. While in the case of Grafana, though, it's worked pretty well so far, so your results may vary. Now let's transition to talking about hosting. So Grafana Labs launched Grafana Cloud in 2017, providing a service where Grafana Labs manages and runs Grafana for you. Let's discuss why hosting makes sense as a monetization strategy. As technology continues to evolve, open source is becoming increasingly complex and harder to operate. Consequently, many find that they need a highly specialized team to understand and fine-tune their internals and utilize open source. One option is to hire this team yourself. However, this can be costly and take a long time to source suitable candidates. As a result, some find a preferential option is to employ companies who can offer this service to them. Some companies may develop these features outside of the open source project and under their own proprietary software. Open core models grant paid access to these new features and enable the maintenance of the company open source project, with a high cost to the company. Using an external company to maintain or fully manage open source projects ensures the code functions at a high level behind the scenes, so it never impedes an organization's work, and ensures companies have access to sufficient open source expertise to maximize the use of technology. Take MongoDB as an example. You can either use MongoDB directly and host it yourself, having to patch it, etc., or you can host your data on Mongo's SaaS platform, letting them do all the work and paying for only what you use. The advantage here, of course, is simplicity for both the provider and the customer, but the disadvantage is the need for the consumer to trust in the host. As an open source company, it also means SLA guarantees are a necessity, which involves heavier internal processes to guarantee uptime. In summary, hosting your open source solution for other companies is a great way to approach monetization, as it makes it easier to integrate, maintain, and debug. So with Grafana Cloud and Grafana Enterprise in place, Grafana Labs is starting to become more successful with monetization. From 2018 to 2020, Grafana experienced increased adoption and started to experience some more major sales wins with the establishment of a more formalized sales organization. This led to the expansion of Grafana Labs' team and the first raise of capital in the form of both a seed round and a Series A round. Grafana Labs being based on open source was a huge competitive advantage. Open source naturally lends itself to the sales process, as organic brand awareness is cultivated through word of mouth amongst developers, the most influential group regarding technology adoption and spend. With open source, a low-touch sales model is naturally created, as potential customers can create their own proof of concepts ahead of purchasing the solution. POCs are like a startup's death kiss and should be avoided at all costs, as they require enormous upfront time and effort and rarely convert into recurring revenue. With open source software, your potential customers do this tedious validation work for you. And now we enter Grafana's lab hypergrowth phase. This is from 2020 and on, and this is the time period when I actually joined the team. The main focus of the current monetization strategy is growing the adoption of our Grafana Cloud offering. At the same time, though, the company still invests a huge amount, around 80% of engineering, into improving Grafana's open source and the surrounding open source ecosystem, with hundreds of engineers like myself contributing to open source daily. This can be seen in how we plan our roadmap, as the community takes a front row seat in what we decide to build. This balance between commercial prospects and community is very challenging. It could be own talk entirely. This is something we're still figuring out today. That being said, a large amount of the features that we build for a given customer are also then released to the broader open source community to benefit from, which is a win-win symbiotic relationship. At this stage, Grafana Labs has matured its sales organization and launched new open source projects such as Loki for logs, Mimir for metrics, and Tempo for traces. The storage and management of this data in our cloud solution is where we've experienced a lot of revenue growth over the past few years. To fuel this growth, Grafana Labs raised its Series B, C, and D during this time period. So kind of hitting the hockey stick growth here. We've also doubled down on our hosting strategy. Part of the strategy has been incentivizing new users to find Grafana and start using Grafana through the cloud offering by introducing a generous free tier plan. This new phase of growth has come with its own challenges and the need to adapt the open source project. For example, in 2021, Grafana open source changed its license from Apache to AGPL. At a high level, this was done to ensure the mutually beneficial partnership between Grafana Labs and managed Grafana services from external cloud providers like AWS, GCP, and Azure. This change did not prevent our users from modifying or providing open source software to others, provided, however, that under an AGPL license, users have to share source code if they are modifying it and making it available to others, either as a distribution or over a network. For distributors, AGPL has the same source code sharing requirements as GPL. Those conditions are designed to encourage third parties looking to modify the software and to also contribute back to the project and the community. So, We just went over Grafana's story. What can we glean from it? Well, we tried 3 different monetization strategies: premium support, proprietary features, and hosting. In the early days, premium support did not lend to too great a success. It wasn't until enterprise and cloud offerings came online that Grafana began to make traction and close some larger deals. Interestingly, nowadays, premium support has kind of crept back into the revenue stream as part of these larger commercial deals, but is still by no means the main driver of revenue. So once commercialization has been proven with the enterprise and cloud approach, Grafana doubled down, raising venture capital and building up engineering and sales organizations to scale the business. So, premium support, hosting, and proprietary features. We're done here. There's actually one other avenue of monetization worth mentioning that might be more accessible. This is in the form of creating courses. If your open source project is popular, you can sell training courses on it. This is a great way for developers to learn how to use the software and earn money at the same time. Many developers have done this on Udemy and other platforms. So, out of all these, which monetization strategy aligns best with the spirit of open source? So here's kind of a ranked list here. We can see here, open core. There's a lot of opportunity for money, but maybe not as much alignment with open source spirit. Several companies have adopted the open core business model. It's worth noting, however, that many believe this form of open source somewhat defeats the purpose of open source software because it utilizes open source but does not always contribute innovation back into the open source project. Despite the open core model's ability to keep a user's freedoms intact, it can stifle the collaborative nature of open source, as a larger percentage of the innovation often happens behind closed doors. Due to this, many prefer the first 3 monetization models as they align more closely with the spirit of open source. In Grafana's case, given 80% of engineering is still contributing back into open source, we've not experienced the same downsides in the open core model that I just described. So all this to say, open core is still viable with the right balance. Okay, so we're on the final stretch here. Let's go over 5 things to keep in mind while on your quest to monetize your open source project. Number 1 is being transparent with the community about the project's monetization and the reasons behind them. Being transparent with the community about the project's monetization plans and the reasons behind them. Engage in open dialogue and seek feedback to ensure that the community feels included in the decision-making process. Number 2 is offer paid features or services that genuinely add value to the open source project. These offerings should enhance the user experience, provide additional functionality, or address specific needs that the open source version does not. Number 3 is avoid over-commercialization. Over-commercializing the project or introducing intrusive advertising that could disrupt the user experience. Respect the community's contributions and values and ensure that the project remains accessible and welcoming to all. Now 4, allocate a portion of the revenue generated from the commercial activities back into the open source project. This demonstrates a commitment to the project's long-term health and ensures the community continues to benefit from its development. And 5, encourage collaboration between the commercial and open source communities. Provide opportunities for community members to contribute to the development of paid features or services, and consider offering incentives for their contributions. So, how am I doing on time? Okay, so we're gonna actually just go over one real-world example of when monetization became controversial. So we're gonna skip MongoDB and go to Docker. So this is an example of where balancing community and commercial interests in open source software kind of went wrong. So Docker is a popular containerization platform, initially gained widespread adoption during its open source Okay, let me start over. Docker is a popular containerization platform, and it initially gained widespread adoption due to its open source nature, which allowed developers to easily create, deploy, and manage applications using containers. The project thrived on community contributions and collaboration, with Docker providing additional enterprise-focused services and products to monetize their efforts. However, tensions arose in Docker when it introduced changes to its business model. In 2017, they announced Docker Enterprise Edition, a commercial offering that included features not available in the open source Docker Community Edition. While this move was aimed at monetizing the platform, it also led to concerns within the community about the direction of the project and potential fragmentation. Furthermore, in 2020, Docker made a controversial decision to limit the use of Docker Community Edition for larger organizations, requiring them to purchase Docker Enterprise Edition subscriptions for certain use cases. This move faced significant backlash from the community, with many developers feeling alienated and disillusioned by what they perceived as a departure from Docker's open source roots. The fallout of these decisions resulted in forks in the Docker codebase. These forks included the creation of projects like Moby and Containered, which aimed to maintain the original spirit of openness and collaboration without the constraints imposed by Docker's commercial interests. So this case serves as a cautionary tale, highlighting the importance of carefully balancing the interests of the community and commercial stakeholders in open source projects. While monetization is a necessity for sustainability, it must be done in a way that preserves the trust and goodwill of the community upon which the project depends. When this balance is disrupted, it can lead to fractures, forks, and ultimately a loss of the very essence that makes the project successful in the first place. So in conclusion, open source monetization is possible, and there's no need for despair, as long as you take a thoughtful and careful approach, having clear and transparent communication with your open source community, focus on value creation, and above all, respect your community. There is a path forward for open source project sustainability without destroying the open source spirit. I hope that you all feel confident and believe that there's a path forward with this, with monetizing open source and not compromising the spirit of open source. A balance can be struck when monetizing open source. In order to maintain its integrity, a project must be open to all users so they can freely invest their time and resources. Yet, companies offering services that make accessing and contributing to these projects simple, or services that improve the quality of the projects, uphold the true identity of open source. Monetization models that follow these lines not only serve to bring money to their owners, but also benefit the overall quality and use of the software. So, what are your next steps today? I'd like you to experiment with monetizing open source endeavors. Maybe try creating a paid course helping users get onboarded. Maybe try offering premium support, or even hosting and running your open source for your users. For those of us without our own personal open source projects, but who rely on open source ecosystem, I want us to be more open-minded about the need for sustainable open source practices, which includes the need for project maintainers to have some form of reward. So open source and monetization may seem like an unlikely pair, but in reality, they really do go hand in hand. So here are some links to further reading, credits for the talk, and thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, Nathan, for making this talk as the first talk, the first keynote of this day, of the Open Source Day. Please come, because you have a duty. You'll be the honored person to give Shrodi the trophy.
Yes.
To Nathan.
Open Source Day, there's a special prize for those that make a great impact in the open source community. The mascot of Schrodinger's hat in the form of this.
Thank you.
Here you go, Nathan.
Thank you.
You did it.
Thank you.
So we are running out of time, but it's because of us, not for you, Nathan. So we can take, I will say, 1-2 questions. So are there any questions? Of course, there are. I take this one. Hi, Roman.
Anyone else? So I can just prepare.
Hello, and thanks for the talk. My question is, with OpenCore, you have some features behind the paywall, behind the enterprise. And what if some of contributors will willingly contribute some feature which contradicts with your enterprise features? For example, just duplicate this feature in open source. What will you do with that?
So the question, if I'm understanding correctly, right, is we use the open core model, we have proprietary features in Grafana. Like what happens if the open source community then rises up and builds these features for the open source community? And what do we do in this case?
Yeah, I have experience of adding feature to Grafana,
Yeah.
and that feature was really minor, just to add last access time to the
Yeah.
dashboards.
Yeah.
But this was also part of enterprise package, and this feature request was rejected.
Got it. Yeah, that's definitely where this balance gets really tricky. I think in the core standpoint, like that's a hard question to answer, right? Because if we release that to open source, then there's less incentive for people to buy it, right? And so I think this actually kind of gets down to the core kind of issue around like, you know, the whole elephant in the room thing of it's really hard to charge someone for something that's already free. And so I think at some point companies have to like draw a line between like what is the proprietary features that we're going to be selling and what are the things that we're going to open source. And ideally we don't burn people too often, because if that balance is put too forward or too far on the commercialization side, then you're going to lose the open source community. So if that happens again, like, you know, if that keeps happening over and over again, where you're submitting a feature request, or like that puts a very bad taste in your mouth, and then, you know, we'll lose the whole thing that's driving Grafana's success in the first place. So I don't really have a great answer for you there, like how that balance is struck, but it's other than the fact that that's a really important, you know, thing for us to consider, and something we're still working out internally in the company. Like, how do we balance the commercial interests, especially with roadmap, right? How do we balance these deals that are coming in and what they want versus what the open source community wants? And I feel like we can't lose sight of open source is the whole reason why it's here. We're successful right now, so hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Question? One more question? Anyone?
Another one. The last
Double
one.
dipping, eh?
Yeah, how do you decide what goes to open source and what goes to closed source?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So typically what will happen is the most ideal case for us is when a company wants a feature that we can build in open source and then release to the rest of the community. So typically what this will look like is, does this feature have like wide applications? Does it have ability to improve the entire offering? Or is it like really niche and something that only this one company might need? If it's like more universal and larger, like we will then push it open source. An example of this was recently with we have this canvas visualization where you can like kind of put elements explicitly onto the dashboard, and a company wanted the ability to call like an API with a button from Grafana. And this is something that we saw a lot of potential to have, like for the hobbyist use case and the open source use case. And so this is something that, you know, we had the company who was interested in this feature like pay us for it to build it, but then also we're able to release that in open source. So like we want to do as many of those things as possible, and not, you know, ideally the line there is we have the commercial interest fuel the open source benefit. So, yep.
So thank you, Roman, for the questions. And of course, are you going to stay for the weekend in Florence, or?
Just through Sunday, yeah.
All right, so you will find Nathan in Florence, of course, but also around the day into Nana Bianca. So if you want to ask him more questions, please reach him out and talk. Not just you, Roman, but also other people. So another round of applause, please.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right. So before going